If you enjoy my stories, please subscribe and hit the like button. I'd really appreciate it. Leave a comment telling me which city you're from and what time it is there. I'm curious to know where my favorite subscribers are from, and share the scariest story that ever happened to you. I'll pin the best one under the video forever. The assignment came in on a Tuesday morning when the air conditioning in my apartment had already given up for the third time that month. My editor, Marcus, had this way of dropping the strangest jobs on my desk with a grin that suggested he knew something I didn't. This time, it was photographing vanishing America, small towns that were slowly disappearing from maps, places where progress had simply forgotten to stop by. "There's this little settlement called Millfield," he'd said, sliding a manila folder across his desk. "Population, maybe 200 on a good day. Perfect for your rural decay series. Should be a quick job. Few days, maybe a week at most." The folder contained a few grainy satellite images and an address that looked like it had been typed on a typewriter from the 1970s. No website, no social media presence, just a dot on a map surrounded by endless farmland in southeastern Kansas. I should have known something was wrong when I couldn't find anyone who'd ever heard of the place. The drive took me through increasingly empty highways until I was following county roads that seemed to exist more as suggestions than actual paths. The GPS on my phone lost signal somewhere around the third hour, leaving me with nothing but handwritten directions I'd gotten from a gas station attendant who'd looked at me like I was asking for directions to Atlantis. "Millfield?" He'd scratched his gray stubble. "Yeah, I know it. Strange little place. You sure you want to go there?" When I asked what he meant by strange, he just shrugged and given me directions that seemed to involve more lefts than should be mathematically possible. The heat was unbearable, even with the windows down. My car's AC had wheezed to death somewhere near the Missouri border, and now I was driving through landscape that shimmered with heat mirages like some fever dream. The corn stretched endlessly on both sides of the road, and the only sound was the monotonous drone of insects that seemed to grow louder with each mile. I almost missed the sign. It was small, wooden, and so weathered that I had to squint to make out Millfield Pop 186 painted in faded blue letters. Below it, someone had added a smaller sign that simply read Quiet Zone Electronics Limited. The road into town was more suggestion than pavement. Potholes filled with gravel that crunched under my tires. The first thing I noticed was how the telephone poles leaned at odd angles, their wires sagging so low they nearly touched the ground in places. The second thing was the sound, or rather, the lack of it. Even the insects had gone quiet. Millfield consisted of maybe a dozen streets laid out in a rough grid, though streets was a generous term for what were essentially dirt paths with the occasional chunk of ancient asphalt. The houses were old, most of them Victorian-era farmhouses that had seen better decades, their paint peeling and porches sagging under the weight of too many harsh summers. The house I'd rented was on what might have generously been called the main street, though it was indistinguishable from any other street except for the presence of what looked like it had once been a general store. The rental had been arranged through a third-party service, one of those anonymous websites that specialized in obscure rural properties. The key was exactly where they'd said it would be, under a flower pot on the front porch that contained nothing but dust and dead stems. The house itself was a 2-story colonial that had probably been white at some point but had faded to the color of old bones. The front door stuck, requiring a solid shoulder to budge it open, and when it finally gave way, I was hit with a wall of stifling air that tasted of dust and something else, something organic and unpleasant. The interior was furnished in what could only be described as persistent 1970s, complete with olive green shag carpet and wood paneling that seemed to absorb what little light filtered through the yellowed curtains. The power was on, but the lights were dim, casting everything in an amber twilight that made the shadows deeper than they should have been. I set my equipment down in what passed for a living room and tried to get my bearings. The house had clearly been empty for a while. There was that particular silence that comes with abandonment, where every footstep echoes and settles in ways that suggest the building has forgotten how to accommodate human presence. My phone had no signal. Not just weak signal, no signal at all. The screen showed the little no-service text with what seemed like defiant confidence. My laptop fared better, though the Wi-Fi it detected was so weak, it might as well have been a rumor. I unpacked my camera gear and decided to take a walk around town before the light faded. I needed to get a feel for the place, understand its rhythms and textures before I started serious shooting. The heat outside was even worse than in the car. It wasn't just hot, it was thick, oppressive, the kind of heat that settles on your skin like a damp blanket and refuses to lift. The air shimmered constantly, making everything appear slightly out of focus, as if the entire town existed behind a layer of water. I walked past the general store, which was closed despite the open sign hanging crookedly in its window. Through the glass, I could see shelves stocked with dusty cans and boxes that looked like they'd been there since the Carter administration. No movement inside, no lights. The streets were empty, not just quiet, completely deserted. It was the middle of a weekday afternoon, and I didn't see a single person. No cars moved along the roads. No children played in the yards. No dogs barked behind chain-link fences. Even the cats seemed to have evacuated. The only signs of life were the houses themselves, which showed evidence of recent habitation. Laundry hanging motionless on lines. Flowers in window boxes that were wilted but not completely dead. Screen doors that were closed but not locked. It was as if the entire population had stepped inside simultaneously and decided to stay there. I spent an hour wandering the grid of streets, shooting preliminary frames and getting increasingly unsettled by the absence of anyone to photograph. The silence was so complete that I could hear my camera's autofocus motor clicking like some metallic insect. Every few minutes, I'd pause and listen, hoping to catch the sound of a television or radio, a conversation drifting from an open window, anything that would suggest normal human activity. Nothing. The only sounds were the distant hum of power lines and a metallic creaking that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. When I looked up, I could see the telephone wires vibrating slightly, as if they were carrying more current than they were designed for. Some of the poles sparked occasionally where the lines connected, tiny blue flashes that were there and gone so quickly I couldn't be sure I'd actually seen them. As the afternoon wore on, the heat seemed to intensify rather than fade. By 5 o'clock, when I would have expected at least some relief. The temperature felt like it was still climbing. The air itself seemed to be getting thicker, more viscous, until breathing became a conscious effort. I was heading back toward my rental when I finally saw another human being. He was sitting on the porch of a house at the end of the courthouse street, an elderly man in overalls and a straw hat that had seen better decades. He was motionless in a wooden chair, staring out at the empty street with a kind of stillness that suggested he'd been there for hours. I approached slowly, my camera hanging around my neck, ready to ask permission before taking any shots. "Excuse me," I called out, when I was close enough to be heard without shouting. He turned his head toward me with mechanical precision, and I got my first good look at his face. It was weathered and deeply lined, the kind of face that spoke of decades spent working under an unforgiving sun. But his eyes were what stopped me. They were pale blue, almost colorless, and they fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "You're the photographer," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, I'm Zach." I stopped at the bottom of his porch steps. "I'm documenting rural communities for a magazine feature." He nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he'd already known. "First time in Millfield?" "Yes, sir." "Where are you staying?" I pointed back toward my rental. The house on Main Street. The Colonial. Something shifted in his expression, though I couldn't quite identify what it was. Concern, maybe, or resignation. That house has been empty for a while. The rental company said it was available for short-term stays. Short-term. He repeated the words like they meant something different to him than they did to me. "How long you planning to stay?" "A week, maybe less. Just long enough to get what I need." He was quiet for a long moment, staring past me toward the house I'd indicated. When he spoke again, his voice was lower, more careful. "Stranger, let me give you some advice. When the temperature hits 93, you keep your windows closed, keep your doors locked, and whatever you do, don't look outside." "I'm sorry." "After 93, don't open up. You understand me?" I stared at him, trying to process what he'd just said. "Is there some kind of security issue? Crime problem?" He shook his head slowly. "Not crime. Something else. Something that comes with the heat." "What kind of something?" But he'd already turned away, settling back in his chair with the same mechanical precision he'd used to turn toward me. "You'll see," he said to the empty street. "If you stay long enough, you'll see." I waited for him to elaborate, but it became clear that the conversation was over. He'd returned to his motionless vigil, staring out at nothing with those pale, disturbing eyes. Walking back to the rental, I found myself looking more carefully at the other houses. Most had their curtains drawn, despite the early evening hour. A few had windows open, but even those seemed to be positioned to avoid direct lines of sight to the street. It was as if the entire town was designed to keep its inhabitants from seeing or being seen. The temperature, according to my phone's weather app, was 87 degrees. Hot, but not unusually so for Kansas in July. Certainly not hot enough to warrant the old man's cryptic warning of about 93 degrees. Back at the house, I tried to get some work done. My laptop was running slower than usual, the fan whirring constantly as it struggled against the heat. The few photos I'd managed to take looked good. There was something about the quality of light in Millfield that gave everything an otherworldly cast, as if the entire town existed in perpetual golden hour. But as evening approached, I began to understand why the rental agency had such trouble keeping tenants. The house was stifling, not just warm, genuinely oppressive. The air seemed to press down with physical weight, making every movement feel labored. I tried opening windows, but there was no breeze. The air outside was just as thick and motionless as the air inside, offering no relief. The electrical system was clearly struggling. Lights flickered constantly, and my laptop charger generated heat like a small furnace. The refrigerator in the kitchen made sounds that refrigerators shouldn't make, grinding, clicking noises that suggested mechanical distress. By 10 o'clock, I was seriously considering sleeping in my car. The air inside the house had taken on an almost syrupy quality that made breathing feel like drowning. Every surface was hot to the touch, from the doorknobs to the walls themselves. It was as if the building was generating its own heat, radiating it from within like some massive malfunctioning oven. I tried to call Marcus to report in, but my phone still showed no signal. The Wi-Fi connection had degraded to the point of uselessness, web pages timing out before they could load completely. I was effectively cut off from the outside world. That's when I first heard the voices. It started as a low murmur, so quiet, I initially thought it was the sound of the house settling or the electrical system humming. But as I sat still and listened, I began to pick out individual tones, rising and falling in patterns that suggested conversation. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, as if the walls themselves were whispering. I walked through the house, trying to locate the source, but the voices remained equally audible in every room. They weren't coming from neighboring houses. They were too close for that, too immediate. They weren't speaking English. At least, I didn't think they were. The syllables were wrong, too soft and flowing, with pauses in places that didn't match natural speech patterns. It sounded almost like singing, but without melody. A rhythmic chanting that rose and fell with a hypnotic regularity. I checked every room, looking for a radio or television that might have been left on, but found nothing. The voices continued, sometimes growing so quiet I had to strain to hear them. Other times, swelling to the point where they seemed to be coming from inside my own head. By midnight, I'd given up any hope of sleep. The heat was unbearable, the voices persistent, and every attempt to get comfortable only made things worse. I sat in the living room with my laptop, trying to work on processing the day's photos, but the screen kept dimming and brightening on its own, making fine detail work impossible. That's when I noticed the smell. It was subtle at first, just an undertone beneath the dust and stale air. But as the night progressed, it became stronger, more distinct. It was organic, unpleasant, the smell of something that had been wet and then dried, repeatedly, until it took on a musty, fungal quality. The smell seemed to be coming from the walls themselves, as if moisture was seeping through the paint and plaster. I ran my hands along the surfaces, looking for signs of water damage, but found only dry, hot wood and wallpaper that felt feverish to the touch. Around 2 a.m, the voices stopped. The silence was so sudden and complete that it felt like a physical presence in the room. Even the electrical humming ceased, leaving me in absolute quiet for the first time since I'd arrived. The relief was so intense that I actually sighed out loud. That's when I heard the tapping. It was soft, rhythmic, coming from the ceiling directly above where I sat. Tap, 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 pause, tap, tap, tap. Like someone walking around in the upstairs bedroom, but with footsteps that were too light, too precise. I grabbed a flashlight and headed upstairs. The steps creaked under my weight, each one seeming to echo longer than it should. The hallway at the top was dark, all the bedroom doors closed, except for the one at the far end, the one directly above where I'd been sitting. The door was open just a crack, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. The tapping had stopped as soon as I'd started climbing the stairs, leaving the upper floor in the same oppressive silence as the rest of the house. I pushed the door open and swept the flashlight beam across the room. It was empty, except for a few pieces of old furniture covered with dusty sheets. No signs of disturbance, no explanation for the sounds I'd heard. But the smell was stronger up here, much stronger. It filled the room like a presence, thick and cloying, with undertones that made my stomach turn. It was the smell of decay, but not the clean decay of something that had died and dried. This was the smell of something that was dying slowly, wetly, over and over again. I searched the room thoroughly, checking for water damage, dead animals, anything that might explain the odor, but the room was dry, empty, unremarkable, except for the overpowering stench that seemed to emanate from the floorboards themselves. When I finally went back downstairs, the voices had returned. They were louder now, more insistent. The rhythm had changed, becoming faster, more urgent, and underneath the strange flowing syllables, I began to hear something that made my skin crawl, the sound of breathing. Multiple voices, multiple sets of lungs, all breathing in perfect synchronization with the chanting. It was as if the house itself had become animate, drawing breath through invisible lungs, hidden in its walls and foundation. I spent the rest of the night in my car. The next morning brought no relief. If anything, the heat was worse. My phone's weather app, when it managed to load, showed a high of 91 degrees, but the actual temperature felt much higher. The air shimmered constantly, and metal surfaces were too hot to touch, even in the shade. I tried to leave. The car started fine, but as I drove toward the edge of town, the engine began making sounds that engines shouldn't make. By the time I reached the main road, steam was pouring from under the hood, and the temperature gauge was firmly in the red zone. I pulled over and popped the hood. The coolant reservoir was empty, bone dry, as if all the fluid had simply evaporated overnight. The radiator hoses were so hot, they were starting to soften, and touching any part of the engine block would have resulted in serious burns. There was no choice but to walk back to town and look for help. The walk took 40 minutes, and by the time I reached Main Street again, I was seriously dehydrated and probably suffering from mild heat stroke. Every step felt like walking through molten air, and the sun seemed to press down with malevolent intensity. The general store was still closed, but I could see someone moving around inside. I knocked on the glass door, and after a few minutes, a middle-aged woman approached. She was thin, pale, with dark circles under her eyes that suggested she hadn't been sleeping well. "We're closed," she said through the glass. "My car broke down. Do you know anyone who could help? A mechanic?" She stared at me for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "You're the photographer." Word traveled fast in small towns. "Yes, My car overheated on the main road. I need to get it fixed so I can leave." "Leave?" She repeated the word with the same strange inflection the old man had used when talking about short-term stays. "Why would you want to leave?" "I need to get back to the city. Work commitments." She was quiet for another long moment, studying me through the glass with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. Finally, she unlocked the door and stepped aside to let me in. The interior of the store was cooler than the street, but not by much. The air conditioning was either broken or turned off, and the ceiling fans rotated slowly without generating any noticeable breeze. The shelves were stocked, but everything looked old. Canned goods with faded labels, boxes of cereal that showed their age in yellowed cardboard. "There's no mechanic in town," she said, relocking the door behind me. "Haven't been one for years." "Is there another town nearby? Somewhere I could call for a tow truck?" "Phone lines have been down since yesterday." She moved behind the counter, her movements careful and deliberate. "Heat does that sometimes. Overloads the system." I pulled out my cell phone, but it still showed no signal. "What about internet?" "Same problem. Everything goes down when it gets too hot." "How hot does it get here?" She looked at me with those dark circled eyes, and for a moment I thought she wasn't going to answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Hotter than it should. Hotter than anywhere should." "What do you mean?" But she'd already turned away, busying herself with rearranging items on the counter that didn't need rearranging. "You should go back to your house," she said without looking at me. "Stay inside. Keep the curtains closed." "Why?" "Because they don't like to be seen. And you don't want to see them." Before I could ask who they were, she'd disappeared into the back room of the store, leaving me alone among the dusty shelves and faded merchandise. I bought some water and snacks, paying cash, since my credit card couldn't process without an internet connection. The woman emerged from the back room long enough to take my money, but she wouldn't meet my eyes, and when I tried to ask more questions, she simply shook her head and pointed toward the door. Walking back to the rental house, I noticed something I'd missed the day before. Every building in town had its windows covered, not just with curtains, but with sheets, boards, even cardboard in some cases. It was as if the entire population was determined to block out not just the heat, but the very possibility of looking outside. The few people I glimpsed were all indoors, moving past uncovered windows like shadows, there and gone so quickly I couldn't be sure I'd actually seen them. But what struck me most was their behavior. They all moved with the same careful, deliberate pace as the woman in the store, as if sudden movements might attract unwanted attention. Back at the house, I tried to make the best of the situation. My car wasn't going anywhere until the heat let up, and calling for help was impossible without phone service. I might as well use the time to document what was clearly a unique community with its own set of strange customs and behaviors. I spent the afternoon shooting interior details, the way the light filtered through covered windows, creating patterns on walls that seemed to shift and move when I wasn't looking directly at them. The way dust motes hung motionless in the air, as if suspended in liquid rather than gas. The way shadows fell at angles that didn't quite match the position of the sun. But as the day progressed, the heat continued to build rather than fade. By 4 o'clock, My phone's weather app, when it could manage to load, showed 92 degrees, close to the old man's warning threshold of 93. The house itself seemed to be responding to the temperature. Wood creaked and popped as it expanded. Paint bubbled on the walls in places where the sun hit directly. The electrical system became increasingly unreliable, with lights flickering and appliances cycling on and off without human intervention. The voices started again around 5 o'clock. This time, they were louder from the beginning, more distinct. I could clearly make out multiple speakers, all chanting in that same flowing, non-English language. But now, there was something else mixed in with the voices, a sound like breathing, but wrong somehow, too deep, too slow, with intervals that were just off enough to be disturbing. And underneath it all, barely audible, was something that sounded like footsteps. Not inside the house, but outside, moving around the perimeter with slow, deliberate precision. I tried to look out the windows, but the combination of heat distortion and covered glass made it impossible to see anything clearly. The few glimpses I caught showed empty streets, but the sounds continued. Voices, breathing, footsteps that circled the house like predators stalking prey. By 6 o'clock, the temperature had hit 93 degrees. That's when the power went out, not just in my house, but throughout the entire town. I could see that the street lights were dark, and no glow emanated from any of the neighboring buildings. The sudden silence was profound. No air conditioning hum, no electrical buzz, no mechanical sounds of any kind. Just the voices, clearer now, without the background noise of modern life. And something else, a sound I couldn't immediately identify, rhythmic and wet, like someone walking through mud. But there had been no rain, and the ground outside was baked hard as concrete. I grabbed my flashlight and tried to peer through the living room window, but the glass was fogged with condensation, despite the heat. When I wiped it clear, I saw nothing but empty street and the dark facades of neighboring houses. But the sound continued, getting closer. I moved to the front door, pressing my ear against the wood. The footsteps, if that's what they were, seemed to be coming up the front walk, slow, deliberate, accompanied by that wet, sucking sound that made my skin crawl. Something knocked on the door. Not a normal knock. 3 soft taps, evenly spaced, like someone testing to see if the wood was solid. The sound was wrong, somehow too light, as if whatever was making it didn't quite understand how knocking was supposed to work. I waited, barely breathing, hoping that whatever was outside would lose interest and move on. But after a few seconds, the knocking came again. Same rhythm, same strange lightness, but slightly more insistent. "Hello?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. No response. Just silence, and then the knocking again. I considered opening the door. Part of me, the rational, professional part, knew that this was probably just a neighbor checking to see if I was all right during the power outage. But something deeper, more primitive, screamed at me to stay put, to keep the barrier between myself and whatever was outside. The knocking stopped. I waited for several minutes, listening for footsteps moving away, but heard nothing. Either whatever had been there was gone, or it was still waiting, just out of earshot. I was debating whether to risk looking out the window when I heard it, a new sound that made my blood run cold. Scratching. Something was scratching at the door, long, slow strokes, like fingernails being drawn across wood. But the sound was too deep, too resonant, as if the nails were made of metal or stone. The scratching moved across the door, from bottom to top, then back down again. Whatever was making the sound was methodical, thorough, as if it was examining every inch of the surface. Then it stopped. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. I stood frozen in the living room, flashlight clutched in one hand, camera in the other, listening for any sign that whatever had been outside was gone. That's when I heard the breathing. It was coming from the other side of the door, so close I could almost feel it through the wood. Deep, slow inhalations and exhalations that seemed to go on far longer than human lungs could manage. And with each breath, I caught a whiff of that same organic smell I'd noticed the night before, the smell of something wet and rotting. I backed away from the door, moving as quietly as possible toward the stairs. Whatever was outside, I didn't want to be on the ground floor when it decided to stop being polite about getting in. But as I reached the staircase, I heard a new sound that stopped me cold, scratching from above. Something was on the roof, moving with the same deliberate, methodical pace as whatever had been at the door. I could hear it clearly through the ceiling, long scraping sounds that suggested claws or nails being dragged across shingles. More than one something. The sounds were coming from multiple locations, as if several creatures were exploring the roof's surface, looking for points of entry. I was trapped between whatever was at the door and whatever was above me, with no clear path to safety. The windows were an option, but that would mean going outside into the open, where anything could be waiting. The scratching stopped, both from the door and the roof. The sudden silence was worse than the sounds had been. At least when I could hear them, I knew where they were. Now they could be anywhere or everywhere. I waited, counting heartbeats, straining to hear the slightest sound that would give away their position. But the silence stretched on, broken only by the distant whisper of voices that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Then, without warning, something slammed into the front door. The impact was tremendous, shaking the entire house and rattling the windows in their frames. I heard wood splinter, and for a moment, I thought whatever was outside had broken through. But the door held. Another impact, harder this time, and another. Whatever was trying to get in was both powerful and persistent, hammering at the door with mechanical regularity. I ran upstairs, looking for another way out. But every window I checked showed the same thing, empty streets and dark houses, as if the entire town had been abandoned. No help was coming. I was on my own. The pounding at the door continued, accompanied now by that wet, scraping sound I'd heard earlier. Between impacts, I could hear something that might have been communication, low, guttural sounds that had the rhythm of speech, but none of the familiarity of human language. I barricaded myself in the upstairs bedroom, pushing furniture against the door and settling in to wait for dawn. Whatever was happening in Millfield, it seemed to be primarily a nighttime phenomenon. If I could just survive until morning, maybe I could figure out a way to escape. But as the hours passed, I began to realize that morning might not bring the relief I was hoping for. The temperature wasn't dropping. If anything, it seemed to be getting hotter. My phone, when it managed to turn on, showed readings that climbed steadily through the night. 94, 95, 96 degrees. In the middle of the night. in a region where temperatures should have dropped at least 20 degrees after sunset. And the sounds weren't stopping. The pounding at the front door continued with mechanical persistence. The scratching on the roof grew more intense, more focused, as if whatever was up there had found weak spots and was working to exploit them. Worst of all, the voices were getting clearer. What had started as distant whispers was now clearly audible speech, though in no language I recognized. The syllables flowed together in patterns that seemed almost familiar, as if I should be able to understand them, but couldn't quite make the connection. And underneath the voices, growing stronger with each passing hour, was the sound of breathing. Multiple sets of lungs, all synchronized, drawing air in and expelling it with the same deliberate rhythm as the chanting. It was as if the entire town was breathing together, thinking together, acting as a single organism with a collective purpose I couldn't begin to understand. Around 4 a.m, everything stopped. The pounding, the scratching, the voices, all of it ceased simultaneously, leaving me in absolute silence for the first time since the power had gone out. The relief was so intense that I actually collapsed against the barricaded door, my legs too weak to support me any longer. But the silence didn't feel like victory. It felt like anticipation, as if whatever had been testing the house's defenses had finished its reconnaissance and was now preparing for the next phase of whatever plan it was executing. I stayed awake until dawn, listening for any sign that the creatures had returned, but the house remained quiet. And when the first light began filtering through the covered windows, I finally allowed myself to believe that I might have survived the night. I was wrong. Moving the furniture away from the bedroom door took longer than it should have. Everything felt heavier than it had the night before, as if the heat was affecting not just the air, but the fundamental properties of matter itself. My movements felt sluggish, labored, like I was moving through water instead of air. The hallway was stifling. Despite the early hour, the temperature inside the house felt like it was already approaching the previous night's peak. Every surface radiated heat, and the air itself seemed to shimmer with the same distortion effect I'd noticed outside. Downstairs, the front door was intact but scarred. Long gouges marked the wood from top to bottom, deep enough to expose the grain beneath the paint. Whatever had been trying to get in had claws or nails capable of cutting through solid hardwood like it was balsa. But that wasn't the most disturbing discovery. The power was back on, but the clocks were wrong. Every timepiece in the house, the microwave, the coffee maker, the alarm clock in the bedroom, showed different times, all of them several hours off from what my phone indicated. It was as if time itself had become unstable, flowing at different rates in different locations. My phone showed 6:47 a.m. and a temperature of 97 degrees in early morning, before the sun had even fully risen. I tried to process this information rationally. Heat islands were a documented phenomenon. Electrical problems could affect timekeeping. There were logical explanations for everything I was experiencing. But logic felt increasingly irrelevant in Millfield. I needed to get out. Car or no car, I had to find a way to leave before another night fell. The walk to the main road was only a few miles, and from there I could flag down a passing motorist or continue on foot until I reached a town with working communication systems. I packed light, camera, memory cards, a bottle of water, and the few snacks I'd bought at the general store. Everything else could be replaced. Getting out alive was the only priority that mattered. But when I stepped outside, I realized that my problems were worse than I'd thought. The streets weren't empty anymore. People stood in their yards, motionless, staring in my direction with the same pale, unblinking eyes I'd seen on the old man the day before. Men, women, children, an entire community arranged in perfect stillness, watching me with expressions that were too uniform, too controlled to be entirely human. They didn't speak. They didn't move. They just watched, their heads turning in perfect synchronization as I walked past, tracking my movement with mechanical precision. I tried to ignore them, focusing on putting one foot in front of the other, heading toward the main road and whatever chance of escape it might offer. But the sensation of being observed by dozens of pairs of eyes was overwhelming, oppressive in a way that made my skin crawl and my heart race. "Morning," I called out to a woman standing in her front yard, hoping to break the spell of silence that seemed to have fallen over the town. She didn't respond. She didn't even blink. She just continued staring with those pale, empty eyes that reflected nothing of the world around them. I tried again with a man standing beside his mailbox. Same result. He might as well have been a mannequin for all the life he showed. By the time I reached the edge of town, I was practically running. The weight of all those stairs pressing against my back was unbearable, and the heat was becoming so intense that the asphalt beneath my feet had started to soften, leaving footprints in the pavement. My car was where I'd left it, steam still rising from under the hood despite having sat motionless all night. I tried starting it anyway, hoping that cooler temperatures might have allowed the engine to recover enough for a short drive. Nothing. The battery was completely dead, as if all the electrical energy had simply drained away. I started walking. The main road stretched ahead of me like a ribbon of molten tar, shimmering with heat distortion that made everything beyond a few hundred yards appear to waver and dance. No traffic was visible in either direction, which wasn't entirely surprising given how remote this area was. But I'd been hoping for at least the occasional farm truck or delivery vehicle. The heat was incredible. With every step, I could feel moisture being sucked out of my body, leaving me lightheaded and disoriented. The water I'd brought was warm within minutes and provided little relief. Sweat evaporated almost instantly, leaving my skin dry and tight. I'd been walking for maybe 20 minutes when I realized I wasn't alone. At first, it was just a sense of being followed, the kind of primitive awareness that raises the hair on the back of your neck. But when I turned around, I could see them clearly, the people from town, walking behind me in a loose group, maintaining a constant distance of maybe 100 yards. They moved with the same synchronized precision I'd observed in their staring, their steps perfectly coordinated, their pace never varying despite the brutal heat. None of them showed signs of distress or fatigue. They just followed, patient and persistent, like a pack of predators waiting for their prey to tire. I increased my pace, hoping to outdistance them, but they matched my speed effortlessly. When I broke into a jog, they did the same. When I stopped to rest, they stopped as well, maintaining that precise 100-yard gap as if it had been measured with surveying equipment. But it was their silence that was most disturbing. No heavy breathing despite the heat and exertion. No conversation among themselves. No sounds at all except for the soft whisper of their footsteps on the superheated asphalt. After an hour of walking, I was in serious trouble. The heat was approaching levels that would be dangerous, even for someone in peak physical condition with unlimited water. My head was pounding, my vision was starting to blur, and my legs felt like they were made of lead, but my followers showed no signs of fatigue whatsoever. I turned to face them, hoping to finally get some kind of response, some acknowledgement that we were all human beings trapped in the same impossible situation. "What do you want?" I shouted across the distance between us. They stopped walking, but didn't answer. Just stood there in their loose formation, staring at me with those empty, pale eyes. "I'm trying to get help," I called out. "The heat, the electrical problems, this isn't normal. We need to get word to the outside." Still no response. But something in their posture changed, a subtle shift that suggested they were no longer content to simply follow. They began walking again, but faster now, closing the distance between us with deliberate intent. I ran. It wasn't a decision so much as an instinctive response to the sudden spike of adrenaline that flooded my system. My legs moved without conscious direction, carrying me down the road at a pace that would normally have been impossible in such heat. But they ran too, and they were faster. The synchronized footsteps behind me grew louder, closer, maintaining a rhythm that never varied despite the increasing pace. I could hear their breathing now, the same deep, slow respirations I'd heard through the walls of the house, but multiplied by however many people were pursuing me. I couldn't look back. Looking back would mean slowing down, and slowing down would mean being caught by whatever the people of Millfield had become. The road ahead wavered and danced in the heat distortion, making it impossible to judge distances or spot potential shelter. But I could see something in the distance that gave me hope. A structure of some kind, possibly a gas station or roadside store. I pushed myself harder, ignoring the protests from my lungs and legs, focusing entirely on reaching whatever sanctuary that distant building might provide. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't a gas station, it was a billboard, just a large sign advertising some long-defunct tourist attraction, standing alone beside the empty road like a monument to forgotten commerce. And standing in front of it, blocking my path, was a figure I'd never seen before. It was tall, much taller than any human should be, maybe 7.5 feet from head to toe. Its body was elongated, stretched, as if someone had taken a normal person and pulled them like taffy until all their proportions were wrong. Its skin was pale, almost white, with a waxy texture that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. But it was the face that stopped me cold. It had no mouth. Where a mouth should have been, there was only smooth skin, unbroken and seamless. Its nose was barely a suggestion, 2 small slits that might have served for breathing, but its eyes were completely black. Not dark brown or deep blue, but true black, like looking into empty holes in its skull. And they were fixed on me with an intensity that made every primitive warning system in my brain scream in terror. I skidded to a halt, my momentum carrying me several steps closer to the thing before I could stop myself. Behind me, I could hear the synchronized footsteps of my pursuers growing closer. I was trapped between the familiar threat of the people from town and this new, impossible horror that shouldn't exist. The tall figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching me with those black, empty eyes, its head tilted slightly to one side in a gesture that might have been curiosity. That's when I noticed its arms. They hung at its sides, but the joints were wrong. The elbows bent backward, giving its limbs an insect-like appearance that made my stomach churn. Its fingers were too long, ending in what looked like black nails or claws that gleamed wetly in the harsh sunlight. I could hear the people from town behind me, their footsteps slowing as they approached. When I finally risked a glance over my shoulder, I saw them arranged in a loose semicircle, cutting off any possibility of retreat. But they weren't looking at me anymore. They were looking at the tall figure. And for the first time since I'd arrived in Millfield, I saw expression on their faces. Fear. Pure animal terror that seemed to radiate from them like heat from pavement. Whatever the tall figure was, even the people of Millfield were afraid of it. The thing began to move, not walking, flowing. Its legs moved in a way that suggested joints where joints shouldn't be, carrying it forward with a gliding motion that was both hypnotic and deeply wrong. As it approached, I caught its scent, the same organic rotting smell I'd detected in the house, but concentrated, overwhelming. I couldn't move, not because I was paralyzed by fear, though terror was certainly part of it. I simply couldn't make my muscles respond to my brain's increasingly frantic commands to run, fight, do anything except stand there and watch as the impossible creature closed the distance between us. It stopped just outside arm's reach, towering over me like some fevered dream made manifest. Up close, I could see details that my mind struggled to process. The way its skin seemed to shift and flow like liquid while maintaining a solid appearance, the strange patterns that moved beneath its surface like veins filled with black blood, the complete absence of any recognizable human characteristic despite its roughly humanoid shape. It raised one of its backward jointed arms, extending those two long fingers toward my face with deliberate slowness. I wanted to flinch away, but my body wouldn't respond. I could only watch as those black claws approached my eyes. And then it touched me. The contact was electric, sending jolts of sensation through my nervous system that were part pain, part pleasure, and part something for which I had no name. Images flooded my mind. Not memories, but visions of things that had never happened and places that had never existed. I saw Millfield as it truly was, not a dying rural community, but a focal point for something vast and alien. The heat wasn't weather. It was a side effect of proximity to entities that existed in dimensions where temperature had meanings human science couldn't grasp. The people weren't human anymore. They'd been changed, converted, turned into something that served as receivers for signals broadcast from spaces, between spaces. Their synchronized movements, their empty stares, their collective breathing. All of it was part of a larger network, a communication system that spanned realities, and I was being inducted into it. The knowledge flowed into me with the force of a flood, rewriting my understanding of everything I'd experienced since arriving in Millfield. The voices in the walls hadn't been supernatural phenomena. They'd been the sound of data transmission, information flowing between nodes in a network that used human consciousness as its medium. The tall figure released me and stepped back, its black eyes reflecting something that might have been satisfaction. I could feel the changes beginning immediately, a loosening of my sense of individual identity, a growing awareness of the collective consciousness that connected every resident of Millfield. But I fought it. Some core part of my personality, the part that had driven me to become a photographer, to document and preserve individual moments in time, rebelled against the dissolution of self that was trying to overtake me. I held on to my memories, my experiences, my sense of being a discrete entity separate from the network that was trying to absorb me. The tall figure tilted its head again, and I sensed something like surprise from it. The conversion wasn't proceeding as expected. I was resisting in ways that others hadn't. That resistance gave me just enough autonomy to act. I turned and ran, not down the road toward uncertain freedom, but directly into the cornfield that bordered the highway. The tall stalks might provide cover, confusion, a chance to break line of sight with my pursuers and find some way to escape. Behind me, I heard sounds that didn't belong in any earthly vocal range. Low, harmonious tones that seemed to coordinate the response to my flight. The people from town began moving, spreading out to cut off possible escape routes. But they moved with less precision than before, as if my resistance had introduced some kind of interference into their collective signal. The corn was a maze of green walls that rose high above my head, providing blessed relief from the direct sunlight, but trapping the heat in humid pockets that made breathing even more difficult. I ran without direction, turning randomly at intersections, hoping to lose myself so thoroughly that pursuit would be impossible. But I could hear them behind me, the synchronized footsteps of the townspeople and something else, a sliding, flowing sound that had to be the tall figure moving through the corn with its unnatural grace. The sounds were getting closer. I burst through a wall of corn into a small clearing and found myself face to face with another tall figure. This one was slightly different, smaller, perhaps only 7 feet tall, with skin that was more gray than white. But it had the same backward jointed arms, the same black eyes, the same absence of mouth. And it was waiting for me, as if it had known exactly which route I would take through the maze. I spun around, looking for another way out, but there was nowhere to go. The corn formed solid walls on all sides, and I could hear my other pursuers approaching from multiple directions. The gray figure approached with the same flowing motion as the first, its black claws extended toward my face. But this time, I was ready for the contact. As its fingers touched my skin, I focused all my remaining will on a single thought, the image of myself as an individual, separate and distinct from whatever collective consciousness was trying to claim me. I held on to that image with desperate intensity, using it as an anchor to prevent my identity from dissolving into the network. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The gray figure jerked back as if it had been electrocuted, making a sound that was part hiss and part electronic feedback. The synchronized footsteps behind me faltered, becoming chaotic, uncoordinated. I had disrupted their signal somehow, introduced noise into their perfect system, but the disruption was temporary. I could already feel the network adapting, finding new pathways around my resistance. In seconds, they would regain their coordination, and I would be trapped again. I ran. This time, I didn't try to hide or evade. I simply ran as hard and fast as I could in what I hoped was the direction of the road, crashing through corn stalks and ignoring the cuts and scrapes from their sharp leaves. Behind me, the sounds of pursuit resumed, but they were different now, less organized, more chaotic. My resistance had cost them something, introduced an element of uncertainty into their perfect system. I broke through the edge of the cornfield and found myself back on the highway, perhaps half a mile from where I'd entered. The tall figure was nowhere to be seen, but I could hear the townspeople thrashing through the corn behind me, still pursuing, but no longer moving with their previous coordination. I ran down the highway, my legs moving on pure adrenaline and desperation. The heat was incredible, but I barely felt it. All my attention was focused on the horizon, on the possibility that somewhere ahead lay safety, sanity, a world where impossible creatures didn't exist and entire communities didn't function as nodes in alien communication networks. I ran until my legs gave out, collapsing on the superheated asphalt in a place where the road crested a small hill. Behind me, Millfield was invisible, hidden by distance and heat distortion. Ahead, the highway stretched empty toward an uncertain horizon. I lay there for what felt like hours, slowly rehydrating from a stream that crossed under the road, waiting for the sound of vehicles that never came. Eventually, as the sun began to set, I started walking again, following the highway toward whatever civilization might exist beyond the sphere of influence that surrounded Millfield. The state trooper who found me was skeptical of my story, which was understandable. Heat exhaustion, dehydration, and isolation could explain hallucinations, delusions, temporary psychosis. My claims about impossible creatures and collective consciousness sounded like textbook symptoms of someone who'd spent too much time alone in extreme temperatures. The medical examination at the county hospital revealed severe dehydration and mild heat stroke, but nothing else. No evidence of drug use, no signs of head trauma, no indication of any condition that might explain my account of events in Millfield. But they did find one thing that the doctors couldn't explain. My body temperature was 104.3 degrees Fahrenheit, high enough to be potentially fatal, but I showed none of the symptoms typically associated with hyperthermia. My pulse was normal, my blood pressure stable, my neurological responses appropriate. By every measure except the thermometer, I was perfectly healthy. They kept me under observation for 3 days, during which my temperature gradually returned to normal. The attending physician attributed the anomaly to equipment malfunction, noting that their thermometers had been acting erratically due to a recent heat wave that had pushed regional temperatures to record levels. When I was finally released, I drove straight home to Kansas City and tried to return to normal life. But normal was relative term now. I processed the few photos I'd managed to take in Millfield, but they showed nothing unusual, just empty streets and old buildings. The kind of rural decay documentation that filled photography magazines and gallery walls. No sign of the tall figures, no evidence of the synchronized townspeople, nothing that would corroborate my increasingly unbelievable memories. Marcus was understanding about my failure to complete the assignment. Heat stroke could explain gaps in memory, the conviction that ordinary experiences had been supernatural encounters. He gave me a few weeks to recover and then assigned me to a completely different project, urban architecture in climate-controlled environments. But the heat followed me, not immediately. For the first few weeks after returning from Millfield, everything seemed normal. My apartment's air conditioning worked perfectly, my equipment functioned without problems, and the temperatures stayed within expected ranges. But as summer deepened and the urban heat island effect intensified, I began to notice changes. It started with small things, electronics that ran warmer than they should, air conditioning systems that struggled to keep up with demand despite regular maintenance, thermometers that gave readings that were consistently higher than weather reports suggested they should be. Then the voices started again, faint at first, barely audible over the hum of fans and air conditioners, but unmistakable, the same flowing non-English syllables I'd heard in the walls of the Millfield house. They seemed to come from the building's ventilation system, carried on currents of heated air that circulated through the complex. I tried changing apartments, but the voices followed me. I tried staying in hotels, but they were there too, whispered through climate control systems and electrical circuits that carried more than just power and cooled air. The network was growing, spreading, using the infrastructure of modern civilization to expand its reach beyond the isolated rural communities where it had first taken hold, and I was helping it. That was the realization that came to me gradually, as the symptoms I'd experienced in Millfield began to manifest in Kansas City. My body temperature remained elevated, running consistently several degrees above normal. My movements became more synchronized with the people around me, unconscious mimicry that grew stronger during the hottest parts of the day. Most disturbing of all, I began to understand the voices, not the words themselves, but their meaning, their purpose. They were instructions, coordinates, data that helped the network expand and consolidate its control over human consciousness. And I was receiving them, processing them, even if I wasn't yet fully integrated into the collective. The resistance that had saved me in Millfield was weakening. Each day brought higher temperatures and stronger signals. Each night brought dreams of tall figures with backward jointed arms and black, empty eyes. Each morning brought the growing certainty that my individual identity was a temporary aberration in a process that was both inevitable and irreversible. But I fought it, clinging to my memories, my sense of self, my stubborn conviction that human consciousness was meant to exist in isolation rather than as part of some vast alien network. Tonight, the temperature in Kansas City reached 97 degrees. My apartment feels like an oven, despite the air conditioning running constantly. My electronics are failing one by one, and the voices in the walls are clearer than they've ever been. I'm writing this while I still can, while some vestige of individual thought remains. Tomorrow, the forecast calls for temperatures to reach 99 degrees, maybe higher. I don't think I'll be able to resist much longer. But I want there to be a record, some evidence of what's happening for whoever finds this account. The heat isn't just weather. The isolated communities aren't just dying. Something is spreading, using our own infrastructure against us, turning the warming planet into a broadcast medium for signals that reshape human consciousness. They come when it's hot, when temperatures reach the thresholds that allow their signals to propagate through our electrical systems and communications networks. When the heat becomes so intense that the barriers between dimensions grow thin enough for them to cross over, and once they come, they stay. I can feel them now, even as I type these words. Tall figures, standing in the corners of my apartment, visible only in my peripheral vision, waiting with infinite patience for my resistance to finally collapse. My body temperature is 102.7 degrees, and I feel fine. That's the most terrifying part of all. Found on the laptop of Zachary Morrison, freelance photographer, discovered in his Kansas City apartment on July 23rd. Mr. Morrison was found sitting in his desk chair, unresponsive but alive, with a core body temperature of 106.8 degrees Fahrenheit. Despite the potentially fatal hyperthermia, he showed no signs of distress and appeared to be in perfect health. He has not spoken since being found. The laptop was still recording when emergency responders arrived. The video file shows Mr. Morrison sitting motionless at his desk for 17 hours and 33 minutes, during which he never moved, never blinked, and never stopped staring directly into the camera. His eyes are completely black. The apartment's air conditioning was found to be functioning normally, but internal temperatures were measured at 114 degrees Fahrenheit. The building's other residents reported no unusual heat in their units. Mr. Morrison remains in state custody at an undisclosed medical facility where his condition is listed as stable but unexplained. His body temperature has remained consistently above 105 degrees for the past 6 weeks, with no apparent ill effects. He has been observed to move in perfect synchronization with 13 other patients being held at the same facility, all of whom were found under similar circumstances in locations throughout the Midwest. The attending physicians report that on nights when temperatures exceed 95 degrees, all 14 patients can be heard speaking in unison, though in no language that has been identified. They stop speaking when the temperature drops below 90 degrees. This document is being released by court order as part of ongoing investigations into what authorities are calling heat-related psychiatric episodes occurring with increasing frequency throughout the central United States. The public is advised to remain indoors during extreme heat events and to report any unusual behavior or symptoms to local authorities immediately. Do not approach individuals exhibiting signs of hyperthermia who appear otherwise healthy. Do not look directly into their eyes. After 93 degrees, keep your windows closed.